Ausländer. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov to you. Evening, everyone. Shavua Tov.
That's too much light.
Shavua Tov, and welcome to all. Good to see you. Tonight we're going to be dealing with the laws of idol worship. We're on chapter 8. The subject is actually extremely relevant because in previous chapters, and I believe there was some issues with Friday's shiur in terms of technical connection. But up until now, we've been learning about what you may or may not do in terms of idol worship, what is permitted, what is not. And hopefully for the great majority of us here, this is not really an issue in that. The Yetzer Hara for idolatry has, for the most part, been eradicated totally from the world. So it's not like any of us wake up in the morning and say, hey, I've got this urge to go and worship an idol. It's actually a Yetzer Hara that we told disappeared a long time ago. However, the realities of the halachot that we're learning both yesterday's shiur and today relate to the prohibition of deriving benefit from objects of idol worship. Now that's really relevant to every single one of us because we can all encounter either on the holidays, if you remember those days when you actually boarded airplanes and went to exotic destinations in the East, where idol worship is quite prevalent, or even locally, there are definitely communities that worship idols in our own country. And there comes the issue of may you benefit from a object, place of idol worship. Let me give you a simple example. You're walking in the street, there is a huge hailstorm, and the only way you can protect yourself is to run to the nearest building, which happens to be a temple of idol worship. You got a shiloh, you got a big problem, because going in there, sheltering yourself from the hailstones would be benefiting from a place of idol worship, and no benefit may be derived. So the halachot that we're learning tonight are kind of far more practical and relevant in terms of idolatry than are, in which way may you serve a particular deity or not. So we're going to talk about everyday objects, inanimate objects possibly, or animals, or trees that are dedicated to idolatry, and how that implicates us in terms of whether we may serve those or not. So I'm going to take you to the text of Rambam, which should be here, just as long as I can get the right. You don't want to see YouTube, you want to see Rambam. There we go. So here we are. And Rambam says that anything which is not been manipulated by man, it wasn't made by man, you may derive benefit. The words in Hebrew are tfisat yad adam. So if a human was involved, so in other words, natural objects would not become deities because it wasn't humans who made it, but the Almighty who made it. So therefore, the wording here is a bit convoluted. It's permitted to benefit anything which has not been manipulated by man. So anything which is in its natural state, even though it's been worshipped as a deity, may be worshipped, may be you may derive benefit from. Therefore, you may derive benefits from mountains, hills, trees, provided they were planted originally with the intent of harvesting their fruit. That's in respect of trees. Springs which provide water for many people, animals, despite having been worshipped by pagans. It's permitted to partake of fruits that were worshipped in the place where they grow and to partake of such an animal. So anything which was not created by man. So clearly, an idol was created by man. We're talking about an object that was made, that was created, that was fashioned by human. But things that are natural, that were made by Hashem, and they're out there in nature, even if humans decided to worship it as a deity, that does not, in a sense, consecrate them to be avodah zarah or idol worship, and therefore you can derive benefit. The trees are a little bit more difficult because trees are actually not completely natural. Some trees grow on their own. Other trees are planted by humans. So the intent here is important. What were they planted for? Was the intention to just harvest their fruit. That's fine. Even though later somebody came and worshipped that tree, that doesn't change its status. If it was planted for idolatry, as we'll see a bit later down the chapter, it's called Asherah, and Asherah trees, those are consecrated trees. Likewise with a spring of water. If it's a private spring of water, it could have been drawn, kind of canal, channeled into your property specifically for purposes of idol worship. That's a problem. But if it's a public spring of water, public stream, that is not an issue. Sorry about this. Let's carry on. Needless to say, it's permitted to partake of an animal that was set aside for the purpose of idol worship. Why does Rambam even feel the need to specify that? Because if an animal has been dedicated for idol worship, there was intention, it was never worshipped, but it was dedicated for idol worship, set aside, it cannot be ever used as a sacrifice in Hashem's temple. So it's invalid for that purpose, but that doesn't mean it's become an object of idol worship. Whether it was set aside to be worshipped or set aside to be sacrificed, that would be the same. When do these statements permitting the use of animals apply? When indeed involving them was not committed for the sake of idol worship. So all that happened was that the person took the cow and said, this is a sacred cow, I worship it, and started, bowing down to it. However, if something was physically done to the animal, then it becomes consecrated for idol worship. If however, any deed whatsoever was committed involving it, it is forbidden. For example, one cut off one of its signs for the sake of an idol. So what is that about? So that's in slaughtering, in shechita for kosher, you have to cut through what they call two signs or two simanim in the animal's neck with the shechita knife. What we have in the animal's neck is a trachea as well as the esophagus. And both of these must be cut through in order for the animal to be kosher. However, for the sake of rendering the animal an object of idol worship, cutting off just one of its signs, which would be non-kosher for shechita, but would still render that to be a non-kosher, an object of idol worship. Should one exchange it for an idol, it's forbidden. Similarly, it's forbidden if it was exchanged for an article that was exchanged itself for an idol, since the latter article considered payment for an idol. So something which was an object of idol worship and was then exchanged for something else, and then even if that latter article was an exchange a second time, that's still prohibited. When does this apply? Regarding one's own animal. However, if one slaughters a colleague's animal for the sake of a false deity, or exchange it for an idol, it doesn't become forbidden. So the rule is, a person cannot cause an article that doesn't belong to him to become forbidden. You cannot consecrate something which does not belong to you and turns it into something which is forbidden. Okay, what about ground? A person bows down to virgin earth, doesn't cause it to become forbidden. He has made no change in it. And again, ground was created by Hashem. If he digs pits, channels, and caverns in it for the sake of a false deity, it becomes forbidden. So if we're going to summarize halakha number 1, it is that things in their natural state cannot become objects of idol worship. And only if a physical change was made into an object, a mountain, a stream, a tree, then it becomes prohibited for idol worship. But as long as it remains in its natural state, it cannot become an object of idol worship. If at any stage anybody wants to interject, ask a question, you can either use the chat, or if you prefer, just to unmute yourself and just butt in. I can't see anyone because I'm sharing the screen, but I'll be happy to answer your questions. Halakha number 2. Person bows down to water which was lifted up by a wave. He does not cause the water to become forbidden. So you're at the seaside, and a wave comes over and blows some water from the sea into a little hole that is there between the rocks on the seaside, and that hole in the rock is now filled with seawater, but it's no longer part of the sea because it has been moved by a wave, and it's kind of in its own place. And somebody comes along and says, well, this is beautiful, this is seawater, I want to worship it, this is the source of all sustenance, the sea is so powerful, bows down to it. Does that become prohibited? No, because even though it removed itself from the sea, it was by an act of God. If he picks up water with his hands and bows down to it, becomes forbidden. So that same water, if instead of it having been just blown by a wave, he walked into the water with a bucket, picked up the water and put it into the same rock, now it's an act of man. If rocks slid down from a mountain and they were worshipped where they landed, they're permitted since they were not manipulated by man. So you have rocks from a mountain, they separate themselves from the mountain, they're now on the road, and you walk up to them and say, "Whoa, this is the powerful Table Mountain. That's the source of such powerful energy, and I want to worship the rocks that came up from the mountain." That would not render those rocks prohibited because there was no act of man. If a man cut some stone out, of the mountain, that would be an act of man. That would then make it prohibited. As we see in halacha number 3, simply moving it from one position to another, that is already creating an act, although there's no actual physical act. So Jew stands up a brick with the intention of bowing down to it, doesn't bow down to it. Then a Gentile comes and bows down to it. The benefit from that brick becomes forbidden because standing it up is considered to be a deed. So there was an act of man involved here. And the same would be with an egg. So an egg, normally, if you don't do anything, it lies flat, and now you stood it up. And by standing it up, you now created a deed, an action, and the Gentile then comes and bows down to it, becomes prohibited. If one cuts off a gourd or like and bows down to it, it's prohibited, forbidden. So as long as it's on the tree, you can't really bow down to it, serve its fruit. But if you cut it off and you bow down to it, then it's prohibited. What happens if you said, "I only like the northern half of this fruit, vegetable, because that's the one that's been really toasted well by the sun, and that's really ripe. So I'm consider that one to be a deity. I'm not going to worship the southern half because that one is still a bit raw because the sun never really reached it." So if one bows down to only half of the fruit, the other half is still attached to it, becomes prohibited because of a doubt involved. Perhaps the second half is considered to be a handle for the half which was worshipped. So how do you pick up a large fruit? You take it in its entirety, unless you've cut it off. The other half is kind of a handle for it. It allows you to handle it and to touch it. There's a concept in halacha. In fact, there's a tractate in the Mishnah called Yadayim that deals with handles, and handles are normally considered accessory to the main part of the object. So if the second half of this gourd is actually considered a handle, it would be an accessory and would therefore be prohibited. It's prohibited, and here we come to the concept of an Asherah tree. And I'm sorry, but the halachat are very long, and English goes very far, but here is the concept of Asherah. I'm looking for it in the Hebrew, Ilan. So this is Asherah. Here we go. Ilan sheneta'u mitchila, shenevad asur ba'anav v'zuhi Asherah hamora b'Torah. So a tree which was initially planted for the purpose of being worshipped. This is the Asherah, which the Torah mentions. Remember earlier we spoke about a tree which was planted for other purposes, for fruit or whatever the case, and then you decided you want to worship it. You cannot then prohibit it. But if the tree was planted initially for idol worship, then it's called an Asherah. But a tree which has been planted previously was pruned and carved for the sake of idol worship, even if it was extended on a growth, or a growth was grafted onto a trunk of the tree and branches grew, or was cut off these branches and benefited from them, is forbidden. The remainder of the tree, however, is permitted. So a tree is planted for normal purposes, for harvest. Then it turns into an object of idol worship, and subsequently, the tree grows further while it is being worshipped. So anything which grew further, those branches must be cut off, even if you've pruned it, carved it, etc. So all of that would be prohibited. The original tree is permitted. Similarly, when a person bows down to a tree, the tree itself doesn't become forbidden, but all the branches, leaves, sprouts, and fruits which it produced during that time is worshipped are prohibited. When Gentiles guard the fruits of a tree and say that they're designated to be used to make alcoholic beverages for a particular pagan temple, and the fruits are used for alcoholic beverages which are drunken on their pagan holidays, it is forbidden to benefit from this tree. So it is not really, we don't know for sure it was an Asherah tree. All we know is that at this particular moment, the gods of that deity, of that temple, are watching the tree. They don't want anybody harvest it, and they say, these fruit will make alcoholic beverages for the festival of this particular god. That is considered and assumed to be an Asherah tree. This is the tree ritual associated with the Asherah. Accordingly, one assumes the tree is an Asherah, and therefore its fruit will be used for such purpose. Should be remembered a principle which is important when it comes to idol worship, and that is that the prohibition of idolatry, including benefit from idolatry, is actually a Torah prohibition. When in doubt regarding Torah prohibitions, we take the stricter route, called Safek Deoraita L'Chumra. So we're going to be stricter. So therefore, here we have an assumption. It could be it's an Asherah, but could very well be it's not. But because of the circumstances, so normally we would say, well, it's the circumstances that prohibit it. Because we're dealing with something which is Deoraita, which is something which is a Torah prohibition, the Safek, or the doubt involved over here, would make it something that we're going to be strict about. We continue with Halacha number 4. The following rules apply to a tree under which a false deity was placed. So the tree is there. They've put the false deity underneath the tree because it's just more convenient. People come to bow there and it's shady and it's more pleasant. It's forbidden to benefit from it as long as the deity is located under it. When it's removed, we're permitted to benefit from it since the tree itself is not the entity which was worshipped. So this is not an Asherah. This is a tree which is conveniently being used for idol worship as an accessory. While it's being used, it's prohibited, and once it is no longer used, that is now permitted again. Gentile constructs a building with the intention that the building itself be worshipped. Similarly, when a person that bows down to a building that has already been constructed, they become forbidden. Remember the rule, act of man rather than act of God, and the person is now bowing down to it. It is now forbidden. When the building had already been constructed, it was then plastered and embellished for the sake of worship to the extent that it's considered to be a new entity. So now you have a very simple, modest home. They decided they wanted to use it for idol worship, and they came in and did renovations, plastered it, painted it, make it look much more beautiful than it was before. So the halacha is as follows. One must remove all the new additions. It's forbidden to benefit from them since they were made with the intention of being worshipped. The rest of the building, not a problem. If one placed an idol within a house, so that's similar to the Asherah, so to the tree where you placed an idol underneath it, it's forbidden to benefit from the house while the idol is located within, and once it's removed, the house is permitted. Similarly, it's forbidden to benefit from a stone which was hewn from a mountain with the intention that it be worshipped. Remember, it was hewn out of the mountain for the intention of worship. It's an act of man. It's not a mountain, but it's now a rock which was taken out, prohibited. If it had already been hewn out, but was adorned and embellished with the intention that it be worshipped, even if the stone itself was adorned and embellished, needless to say, if the adornment was added to it or was removed all new additions, it is forbidden to benefit from them since they were made with the intention of being worshipped, but the remainder of the stone remains permitted. Halacha number 5. A stone on which an idol is placed is forbidden as long as the idol is upon it. And once the idol is removed, it's permitted. That very much follows the principles we had earlier. A tree under which you have an idol, or a home, a house in which you have placed an idol. As long as the idol is in it, you may not benefit from it. Once the idol is removed, it is permitted. So there's actually very relevant halachot, because you may want to shelter under a tree, but then you find out that some time ago they had idols underneath it. That wouldn't be a problem. You want to walk into a home, into a house to shelter from a hailstorm, and you discover somebody tells you, wait, but 6 years ago, this used to be rented by such and such a cult group, and they had idols inside, but now the idols are removed, it's permitted. When a person's house, which is located next to a shrine of an idol, falls, it's forbidden for him to rebuild it. So now we're talking about a boundary wall, and you and the temple, there's a wall between you. It's a shared wall. We don't see much of that in our neighborhoods where we live over here. But you go, overseas, and you find houses built right next to each other, and they have common walls between them. So you are now living next to a shrine, a temple, and there's a boundary wall between the two of you, and now the wall collapses. If you rebuild your wall, you're rebuilding a temple. So you're in trouble. How are you going to handle this? If you simply rebuild that boundary wall, it might not even be the wall of your house. It might simply be an outdoor boundary wall. It doesn't matter. How are you going to rebuild that wall without benefiting directly the idolaters of the temple that is there? This is a halachic problem. He says it's forbidden for him to rebuild it. What must he do? He must move the wall within his own 4 cubits and then rebuild it. In this case, 4 cubits, it seems from the commentaries, doesn't actually mean literally like 2 meters. It means a little bit in. So then he's actually building on his own space. And the empty space must not be left free for the sake of the shrine of the idol. Rather, they should fill it with thorns or feces. In other words, today you would put barbed wire down. If you simply move your boundary wall a little bit further down, then you're benefiting the idolatry, because what they're getting is a larger space to utilize for idol worship. So you can't do that. So you move your wall slightly your side, and at the same time you do something to the empty space that you've left, which you can turn to a latrine. Nowadays, I think we would do something like put barbed wire, as I mentioned. If the wall belongs jointly to both a private individual and an idol, it should be considered to belong to them equally. It's permitted to benefit from his half. The half belonging to the idol is forbidden. Similarly, it's forbidden to benefit from all the wall, stones, beams, and earth. That is, now it collapsed, and now you want to kind of salvage the materials. So if the wall was jointly yours and the idol next door, basically half is yours and half is theirs. There's a bit of discussion among the commentaries in halacha whether this means that you can just split it halfway, or whether you actually have to recognize which stones are yours and which stones are theirs. Taking us to halacha number 6. So we know we are not allowed to benefit from a false deity. And we also read right in the introduction to the laws, which I did with you, I think, a week ago, Motzei Shabbos last week, that we have an obligation, abeid te abdun, of destroying all objects of idol worship. So abeid is from that root of abeid te abdun. How are you going to destroy idolatry? So he says the following: you must grind them. So how do you destroy a false deity or the other entities which are forbidden in its account, accessories and offerings? You must grind them and scatter dust to the wind, or burn them and deposit the ashes in the Dead Sea. So if you grind them and go and put the dust, the ground up material in your own property, it may benefit you in terms of becoming compost, benefiting your fields, etc. That's not allowed, so therefore you have to scatter it in the wind, or you can also deposit them in the Dead Sea. Nothing can survive in the Dead Sea, and nobody's ever going to benefit from it. Nobody really goes deeply into the Dead Sea to swim. You cannot do that. Halacha number 7. Although as mentioned above, an entity which cannot be manipulated by man, like a mountain, animal, or tree, even when worshipped, remains permitted. It's forbidden to benefit from its coating. So we did do that earlier. That is, here we have an object which is not manipulated by man, creations of God, mountains, animals, trees, and they worship, they're permitted. We discovered that in halacha number 1. But we're not allowed to benefit from its coatings. So if you went and painted the mountain with gold, or covered the tree with whatever decorations, those would be prohibited. The person who derives any benefit from them whatsoever is liable for lashes. Do not desire the silver and gold which are upon them. Any coating with false deity is considered to be one of its accessories. Halacha number 8. It's permitted to derive benefit from a false deity belonging to a Gentile whose deification was nullified by Gentiles before it entered the possession of a Jew. So there is such a concept as nullification of a deity. If the Gentile who consecrated it by worshipping it says, I don't believe in this deity anymore, it's nonsense. I thought that my source of parnasa would come from this idol that I bought when I was last in Thailand, and I put it in my house and I worshipped it and prayed to it, but my business has gone completely bad. I don't believe in it. And he takes an axe and he smashes it. Okay, is it still an object of idols? So not. He has nullified it because he's an idolater himself, and now he declares it to be null and void. It's called nullification of idols and can't be done. So there's certain conditions that apply to when and how this can be done. So here we have. It was nullified by the Gentile before it entered the possession of a Jew. Once it's yours already, it's too late. But if it was nullified by him before he gave it to you, before he sold it to you, then it is fine. It says you must burn the statues of the gods with fire. This command applies only if they're treated as gods when they enter our possession. If the deification was nullified, they are permitted. But if the false deity belongs to a Jew, it cannot be nullified. Even if he owns it in partnership with a Gentile, its nullification is no consequence. Rather, it's forbidden to benefit from it forever and must be entombed. Similarly, when a false deity belonging to a Gentile enters possession of a Jew, then is nullified by a Gentile, the nullification is no consequence. It's forbidden to benefit from it forever. So only Gentiles can nullify deities, and they can only do it when it's their possession. If it is in our possession, already possession of a Jew, or even in the joint possession of a Jew and a Gentile together, it can no longer be nullified. So what's one of the conditions? A Jew cannot nullify a false deity, even when it's in the possession of a Gentile. So Jews cannot nullify false deities. That's a power only given to Gentiles, to idol worshippers. A Gentile who's a minor or a fool cannot nullify a false deity. It has to be a conscious act, and if he doesn't have the ability, because he is too young or doesn't have the mental ability, then he cannot nullify that false deity, and his nullification would be of no consequence. Similarly, if a Gentile is forced to nullify a false deity, whether it belongs to him or to other Gentiles, even when he's forced to do so by Jews, nullification is of consequence. So it doesn't matter if it's his or not, and even if he's forced to do so by Jews, as long as he nullifies it, it is nullified, even if done during duress. So there's duress, but it has to be conscious. A minor or a fool doesn't have consciousness, is not able to do something consciously. A Gentile who is nullifying his deity, even if it's under threat by others or even by Jews, that is of consequence, and the object will no longer be valid. We talk about Gentiles, not all Gentiles. It has to be Gentiles who themselves are idolaters. It's the only way that idol worship can be nullified is if the nullifier is himself an idolater. If he's not an idolater, his nullifications have no consequence. So you can't have like you have a Shabbos goy that you use for the purposes, of doing certain necessary actions on Shabbos, like you need somebody to take your temperature, because by law you cannot enter into shul before you had your temperature taken. So the shul hires a Gentile. So you cannot hire a Shabbos, an Avodah Zarah goy to simply be your nullificator of idols. It has to be one who's actually an idolater. When a Gentile nullifies a false deity, he also nullifies the connection to idol worship of its accessories. So if there's an idol with accessories and the Gentile nullifies the main object of worship, the accessories become null at the same time. If he nullifies the connection to idol worship of its accessories, it's permitted to benefit from the accessories. The deity remains forbidden until it itself is nullified. The connection to idol worship of an object that was brought to an idol as an offering can never be nullified. So that's an object which is actually brought as an offering, whether it be a flower offering, a drink, oil or wine, etc., or animals. So those are actual objects that not just were dedicated, but were actually used in the service. No nullification is possible there. And halacha number 10, how is an idol nullified? So how does a Gentile actually do this? One cuts off the tip of its nose, tip of its ear, tip of its fingers, smooth out its face, even though none of its substance was destroyed, or sells it to a Jewish jeweler, it is nullified. So if he is destroying it, defacing it, is kind of showing that he has no respect for it. Or if he sells it to a Jewish jeweler, so selling it to a Jewish jeweler, he very well knows that a Jewish jeweler is likely to melt it down and make some other piece of jewelry. So that's equivalent to destroying it. If he gave it as a security for a loan, sold it to a Gentile, sold it to a Jew who is not a jeweler, so he doesn't assume it's going to be destroyed, left it after it was covered by fallen articles without removing them, didn't demand its return after it was stolen by thieves. So those are all acts that don't in any way defile the object and nullify it, because given their security, it still remains. Selling it to another Gentile with the assumption that that other Gentile will continue to worship it. Selling it to a Jew is not a jeweler. He assumes that the Jew wants to worship it. If objects covered it and he left them there, so it's not very respectful. If it was stolen by thieves and he doesn't go out of his way to run after the thieves and get it back by them, so those acts are not very respectful, but doesn't mean he's nullified. But even further, If he spat in its face, urinated upon it, dragged it in mud, threw feces upon it, it is not nullified. Those are not acts of nullification because they don't actually destroy. The act of disrespect, why is he doing it? He's probably doing it because the idol let him down. So he was relying on the idol because he said, I'm going to offer an offering to this idol. I'm going to buy the lottery ticket, and tomorrow night I'm going to check the results, and I'm going to win the lottery, check the results. The idol let him down. He comes in, he takes the idol, he throws it out the window, and relieves himself on it. That's an act of disrespect. So he's showing his anger towards the idol, but that's not called nullifying it. Okay. When a false deity was abandoned by its worshippers in a time of peace, we assume that they nullified it. However, hence benefit may be derived from it. If it was abandoned in a time of war, it's forbidden because the only reason they abandoned it was the war. So if it's just left behind and you don't know whether it was nullified or not, if it was, because the people ran away because it was a time of war, we assume that they still want to come back and hope they're going to, they never nullified it. But if they just abandoned it, we assume they nullified it. Second paragraph, when a false deity becomes broken in the course of nature, so it broke by itself, it is forbidden to benefit from its broken pieces until they've been nullified. So if a person finds pieces of a broken idol, he cannot assume that they were necessarily nullified, because it could be that the Gentiles didn't nullify it and just broke by himself. When an idol falls into pieces, if it could be reassembled by an ordinary person, then each piece must be nullified individually. If it cannot be easily reassembled, then nullifying one of its limbs means that all of them are null. An altar for idol worship has been damaged. It's still forbidden to benefit from it until the majority of it has been destroyed by Gentiles. A platform which has been damaged is permitted. So there is the concept of mizbeach, that's what we call an altar. And there's also something called bimus, which is a platform. And that is a little bit different. So what's the difference between bimus and mizbeach? What's a platform, what's an altar? Platform is one single stone, an altar is many stones. Stones of Markulis, I think they were placed 2 uprights and 1 horizontal above. One constructs a building from them and uses them to pave the roads or like, is permitted to benefit from them. That's obviously an act of nullification. An asherah is nullified when one pulls off a leaf, cuts off a branch, takes a staff or scepter from it, planes off its sides in a manner which doesn't benefit, nullified. One planes its sides in the manner which benefits it, it's forbidden. Its shavings are permitted. So if you plane its sides, it could be considered, kind of a form of pruning, and that would still keep it forbidden. If the sides of an asherah which belong to a Jew are planed off, both it and its shavings are forbidden forever, regardless of whether it was planed for its benefit or not, because a false deity belonging to a Jew can, as we've seen earlier, never be nullified. And that is the end of our shiur tonight. Look forward to seeing you next week. We're not going to be dealing with idolatry. I think we'll skip to another subject in the course of the week. Have a wonderful week and look after yourselves. If there are any questions, please let me know.